Unfiltered is sponsored by BetterHelp. December is all about giving and giving back. I love being able to give gifts. My love language is certainly quality time and giving gifts, not as much receiving gifts. But quite frankly, the best gift that you can give yourself or be given this season is therapy. I've been in therapy for years, on and off. More recently, I've been going every single week, and my therapist is amazing. And one of the reasons I really enjoy talking to her is my schedule is crazy, but I get to talk to her on camera on my laptop or my phone wherever I am in the world. So, whether or not your family gives gifts during the holidays, you get to define how you give to yourself this season. In this season of giving, give yourself what you need with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/newunfiltered today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/newunfiltered. Give yourself exactly what you deserve and what you probably need this holiday season with BetterHelp. In October, before I decided to fully move to London, I came to London alone for my birthday. And prior to coming to London, I went to the library in my hometown, Mansfield, Connecticut, and picked up 4 books. One in particular was by Dr. Vora. I had no idea who she was, but I really liked the vibe of the book, and it was about anxiety. So I was like, you know what? I'm feeling really anxious right now. It's about to be my birthday. I'm about to travel alone. Let me get this book. Over the course of 2 weeks, I finished her book cover to cover, and it was the best book I've read. I talk a lot about anxiety, talk a lot about mental health over the years, and especially being an entrepreneur, being in my 20s, it's certainly something that I am, quite frankly, really okay to talk about because I wish someone had talked to me about this when I was growing up, anxiety, depression, all of it. And I can tell you that it gets a little bit harder when you're older and when you're starting to get into your late 20s, probably your 30s, because you have a lot of questions about the world. And if you're a curious person like me, you may really think deeply about those questions. So I read her book and I was so inspired. I am not a fan of super woo woo stuff. I'm not someone who wakes up every day and takes cold showers. I'm not someone who is really into like rocks and healing and stuff like that. I've got a really good routine. I like to meditate. But aside from that, I'll try anything once. But aside from my current routine, I don't really add things to it unless it's something that I really find to be necessary. And her book warped my perception on my routine, on my anxiety. Something that was such a big takeaway from Ellen's book was that you really can control your anxiety with so many elements. And she goes super in depth about how insane it is the amount of time we spend on our phones, the amount of time we're on technology, we're on the internet, and how, of course, we have more anxiety because look at what we're seeing in the world. I mean, look, there's the news, which you turn on and you may want to cry some days, you may want to smile some days, but then you've got this thing in your hand 24/7, your cell phone, and the access you have is undeniably detrimental to your health. And so this book was amazing. Anyone should pick it up. If you can't afford it, please send me a message. I will send you a copy. It was an incredible book. So today I have Dr. Ellen Vora on the show to get into the nitty gritty of anxiety, why you have it, and how to live your most fearless life. Ellen, thank you so much for being on the New Unfiltered today. I am honored to have you.
Alexa, I am so honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I mentioned in the intro that I read your book, which is called The Anatomy of Anxiety. I know that you are also working on a second book, but in particular, I would love to gear this episode towards those who are in their 20s, perhaps early 30s, and really struggling to figure out a career path. And your book was remarkable for so many parts of my life. I even mentioned that I'm now drinking bone broth in the morning and like putting my feet on the ground. And I don't listen to anything. And your book was just amazing. But Dr. Vora, I would love to start from the beginning. You know, as a kid, were you someone who struggled with anxiety? How did you get into this particular field?
Yes and no. I would say I have my own relationship to anxiety, but that truly was not actually the driver for me to write this book. It had a lot more to do with the fact that this was the pattern I was recognizing in terms of patients coming into my practice, people reaching out to me by DM on Instagram. This felt like the pH of our age. Like if you dip a pH strip into the waters we're all bathing in, It's anxiety. That's the verdict. And I also feel really strongly that we're approaching anxiety incorrectly as the standard of care. And so I feel like there's so much low-hanging fruit and ways that we can better, more effectively support people's anxiety, bring them real relief. And so I just have a compulsive need to get that message out into the world and help relieve human suffering.
At the time that I actually started reading your book, it was the first time I had ever been prescribed a medication, and it was Lexapro, and I only took it for 3 weeks. And I've always really been anti-personally medicine. I'm a big fan of talk therapy. And I think the combo of reading your book and also talk therapy enabled me to feel like I could get through that particular moment in my life on my own. And something I really respect about the way that you approach anxiety is you do it in a very honest way, but also you have many different elements that I think it seems you want to portray when making this decision, right? Like if you need medication, you can get on it, but maybe we can also try this. You wrote this book, I think, during COVID.
Mm.
And I even remember a part in the book where you said, like, usually you don't like to stay up past 11 or something, but like when writing this book, you had to make this sacrifice. So tell me throughout your career, what are some things you've had to do to handle perhaps your own anxiety or stress as your success has grown and increased?
Well, and I'm so glad you brought up medication because it's so important to underline this idea. I really embrace that more Hindu idea of one truth, many paths. And it's, I think that when we're dealing with mental health, everyone is so different. And I think of healing as this mountain, and there are many paths up it. Medication is one completely valid path. Just currently, if you go to see a practitioner, that's the path they're going to focus on. And it's only one of many paths. It's a valid path, but it's not our only path. So if it works for you, that's fantastic. And if it doesn't work for you, that's where I want to intervene and just show up in someone's ear who's like, well, I tried this medication and this medication and this dose, and I've tried everything and nothing's helped. And that person can start to despair and feel like they're beyond hope. And that's not the case. And so I just want to intervene at that point and say, hey, there are other paths up this mountain. Let's try a different tack. And so it's just so important to reduce shame around whatever strategy you figure out can work for you. So as I've gone through my career, what do I do to handle my anxiety? I think that it's really about intention, because when the ego gets involved and you start to think like, oh, okay, so this talk or this meeting feels higher stakes, it's a bigger deal than what I'm used to, I can get really tripped up in my ego and I can start to think it has to go this way, and I'm attached to people thinking of me in a certain way or seeing me in a certain way. And that is not how we co-create with the universe, and I think that I really just always have to remind myself to come back to meticulous integrity with my intention. I am interested in being of service and of helping relieve human suffering, helping shift people out of fear into love. And all I can do is do my best to listen for what I am receiving and translate that into my work and hope that it lands in the people that can benefit from that particular perspective.
Did you always want to be a doctor growing up?
No, no. I was really interested in the human brain and biology, but I was much more interested in being a hip hop dancer, and that was not my life's path. And so I remember at many points in med school, I was like, what am I doing here? This is not me. But inertia really got the best of me, and I kept going. And looking back, I'm really glad. I do think I'm squarely right on my path and in my purpose, but it wasn't obvious to me. That's part of what I'm writing about right now, is how I was surrounded by other med students who had an intuitive knowing. They were like, I've always known I've wanted to be a doctor. I've always known I wanted to be a pediatrician. And I was like, I'm still not sure I want to be a doctor. And I'm in my third year of med school. And so it really took a while for me to connect to that inner knowing and that intuitive voice that tells me, here's what is my correct path. Here's where I feel in alignment.
It's really refreshing to hear that you didn't know what you wanted to do, because I talk often about this and the obsession nowadays young people would have with feeling like they need this overnight sensation. And if they don't get it fast, they're a failure. I had a very non-traditional path. I didn't go to college. I really did the whole broke starving artist thing for years until I got one big yes. But I'm assuming med school in particular is very hard. So I can't imagine being in med school also being like, is this the right thing to do? Do you have any advice for anyone who perhaps is in school and is like, I can't effing do this anymore?
I'm not sure I have the right advice. I think in many ways I made it through med school. Maybe 5% of that was a deeply buried intuitive knowing that this was my path, but 95% of that was actually a very immature kind of adolescent attitude I had, which was almost just thinking of it as not optional. Like the same way high school is just something you do and you don't question it. I almost had that same attitude about college and med school. And so I got through it partly because I didn't really think I had the option to change my life's trajectory. I did try actually to drop out, but it actually is a lot of administrative burden to drop out of med school. And I remember thinking, I'm really too busy with anatomy right now to do all of these meetings and this paperwork and bureaucratic process. So I think I'll just stick it out. And so it's kind of ridiculous in retrospect, but I think I was meant to stick it out. And on some deeply buried level, I knew that. So what's my advice? I think that that's the true anxiety piece from my book. It's really that we have a nudge, an internal compass that helps us know. I think of it like an electric fence, and it kind of shocks us a little bit when we get off course, and it helps us know when we need to course correct in our lives. And there's a difference between hard work and being out of alignment. And so, one of the best things we can do is get good at listening to the difference between those two vibrations. And a lot of our path is really hard work. We have to accept that that's part of what it is. We show up and we do our part, which is work. But when everything in our body is screaming, this is out of alignment for me, then we're off our path and we want to course correct.
The most fascinating thing I found about your book is there was parts of it, to be honest, that I was reading and I was like, the fact that this is so obvious, yet I don't even realize this. Your phone outside of the room or like touching your feet on the ground. There was elements of it that I was like, the fact that, I mean, I'm 26 and the fact that like these are things that we should be implementing in every element of our day, right? Probably from like 1,000 years ago in the time of BC, and we're not. Why do you think that is? Is it because of the phones? Is it because people are so desensitized, I think, nowadays to being in touch with their own emotions?
Well, I think there's a lot that goes into this. And I think that two really aha moments for me. One was when I first learned about an ancestral view of health. And it was basically to understand that it's not rocket science. What seems to optimize human health is just live the way we did over millennia of human evolution. There's no moral superiority to it. It's just what got built into our genome. And so, as much as we can approximate those conditions in modern life, accounting for a few areas where we're able to create more comfort and safety these days. And I think that's something to be embraced. But if we can touch the earth, if we can see the sunrise and see the sunset and get actual healthy amounts of sunshine, to eat real food rather than processed food, to sleep synced up with the sun and the moon, to have community around us. All of these are ways that our body evolved to be optimized. Certainly, movement is a big one. And the further we stray from that in modern life, which we can get pretty far, our body is just thinking like, what is this? I don't know how to be well in these conditions. The other aha moment for me was functional medicine, which is just in its most essence, root cause resolution rather than symptom suppression. And these two viewpoints inform everything in the book because I was trained in conventional allopathic medicine where we're always really just looking to suppress symptoms. And I didn't think there was anything wrong with that. It's like, yeah, this person's depressed. Let's give them a medication that will suppress that depression. And look at me, what a good doctor I am. And for me, it never felt totally right, but I didn't know what the problem was until I understood depression is not a person being broken. It's a communication from the body. Mental illness is not a genetic chemical destiny, like you were born to have this condition. That's our indoctrination. We're taught to think that. But these are communications from the body, and they're communicating generally one of three things: either physical imbalance, unresolved trauma, or some psycho-spiritual unmet need. And so when you start to recognize that, you can say, let's work with that. What's the physical imbalance here? Is there trauma we need to work through and metabolize? Is there some unmet need, like a need for community or purpose or nature or being of service or play or pleasure? And then you start to address that and you can resolve mental illness at the root. And then there's no need for medication.
At the time I was reading your book was around my birthday in October, and I was in a severe episode of like depression and anxiety, the worst that I've ever experienced. And I'm someone who just keeps going. I mean, I was like on this 100 miles an hour, almost like race against myself since June. And reading your book and the way that you were able to explain anxiety and this being like, this is your body telling you something is wrong. I was someone who was like, gym, workout, therapist, business calls and being successful. That's fine. But I still kind of feel like shit, but like, it's fine. It's fine because I'm doing all of the things. And again, what I found so respectable about your book is to have you say like just because you're doing all those things doesn't mean that your body's still not telling you that you need to stop. So with your clients, and I know you have some high level executives and whatnot, do you find that there's a different way you treat say type A clients versus those who are maybe more type B or whatever the other personality types are?
Yeah. And I think I love what you're bringing up. Really, the art form that I want all my patients to learn is to listen, because we used to think, let me just listen to what the doctor says. And now in the wellness movement, it's like, let me listen to what the Instagram influencer says, and it's basically we just take all the advice at face value and we forget that the real thing we want to listen to is our body. And I always joke about also like with wearables. Now we're like, let me listen to what the instrument says. And it's like, it's all valuable input, but we don't take anything without re-examining, is this right for me? And is this right for me in this moment, in this season of my life? And so the most elegant compass is to get good at listening to your body, because one day going to the gym might actually be the key to you feeling better. And on a different day, it actually might be an Epsom salt bath instead. And we just want to get very good at the practice of listening. When I'm working with different kinds of patients, I'm thinking a lot about Gretchen Rubin's types of, is someone an upholder or a questioner? Are they an obliger, rebel? And like that really informs how I'm going to dole out advice. And I'm glad I finally now understand this, because in the past, I loved an upholder. I'm an upholder, and I have a very Mr. Fix-It approach to mental health. And the two of us together, we think we like each other's approach, but it can create disaster. And so, like, I love an upholder patient, and I'm like, okay, do these 5,000 things and you'll feel better. And they'll go home and they will do 5,000 things. And they'll come back to me, straight A plus plus student, but they're running ragged and they're suddenly orthorexic. And so I've had to really dial back and recognize, if someone's going to do everything that I suggest, then I need to really only give them very low key, gentle suggestions at first. And we need to build up gradually. Whereas if I have someone who's more of a rebel or an obliger, there's sometimes some psychological games we have to play to help elicit behavioral change.
Do you ever prescribe medication for any of your patients?
I do. Yeah. I mean, once in a while, it feels like the correct path up the mountain. It's not frequent. And I'll admit, it's usually in someone who is what's called not medication naive. So if someone has never been on a medication, at this point in my practice, it's rare that I would feel that we need to start them on a medication. But I've had many patients who medication almost seems to have created a need for itself. And sometimes we work really hard using holistic strategies to shore that up and support them in other ways. But sometimes there's just still the need to go back to that medication. And I'm also supporting patients with medication tapers, and that requires quite a bit of prescribing.
Yeah, and I like that you say that honestly, right? You're not like talk therapy and feeling your feet on the ground. So it's nice that you've got both approaches and you mesh them together. I'm curious, when you were in school, this more holistic approach to health and wellness, anxiety, depression, were you taught this? Do you not get taught this in school when you're going?
No, I mean, certainly not when I was in med school. This was not the approach. And I don't think it is currently either. This is really what's being taught in these little niche rogue schools around functional medicine. It is, by the way, the approach that naturopaths have always
Mm.
taken. There's much more of a root cause resolution mentality and a vitalism, and understanding that the body is actually very good at healing itself if you give it the correct conditions. And so this is not brand new, and functional medicine didn't invent this, but it's not yet made its way to the very slow to move entrenched practices in allopathic medicine.
And if someone's listening to this and, doesn't necessarily live, I think you're based in Manhattan, correct? Doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily, can't perhaps afford your services or, isn't based in Manhattan, how do they go about finding someone who believes more in your approach to medicine?
I think that's part of the beauty of this approach, is that it doesn't really have to exist behind a paywall, or even with a highly credentialed, highly skilled practitioner. There are niche cases where you really do want a co-pilot who's helping you investigate, but for the most part, this is diet and lifestyle modification. It's things that are safe, that are accessible, that are free, that are very DIY. So you really just need a good book, and that's usually in the $20 to $25 price point. And sometimes an online group can help with troubleshooting, but this doesn't have to be expensive. And if you do want a practitioner and a functional medicine practitioner is out of reach, usually a naturopath is a more affordable option. And it can be so good. Even a functional health coach can be a terrific support for this approach.
And is that though the same as a therapist? Like if someone is really right now feeling anxiety, depression, I mean, do they want to find someone like you? Do they need to go to more of like somewhere more specific that may be a more aggressive, I guess, form of treatment of healing?
Yeah, it's tough to answer in a generalizable way, because that's my philosophy on mental health, is that it generally makes sense to start with what in the book is referred to as false anxiety, all the ways that we are physically out of balance. And we just have to understand mental health is physical health. Good mental health is a reflection of a healthy brain. And a healthy brain is a reflection of it has the right vitamins, minerals, nutrients it needs. It's not inflamed. Blood sugar isn't swinging wildly around. We're sleeping adequately, moving our bodies, getting sunshine, all of these things our bodies need. And so sometimes you might want to start with a health coach or a naturopath and get your body tuned up so you're physiologically in balance. Some of my patients, that's all they need. And then some people need ongoing psychotherapy. Maybe they have unmetabolized trauma. Maybe they have complex grief. Maybe they have a lot of um, limiting beliefs or narratives and stories that they're telling themselves that are actually preventing them from moving forward. And that's where a therapist can be so great. And of course, just the professional caveat is that if someone were unsafe in any way, they would certainly want to work with a mental health practitioner who can appropriately triage and make sure that they're in the right hands for that.
I'm curious what you think about social media right now. You touched on, people looking at influencers and social media personalities as perhaps this new form of like medicine and healing. And you see someone who has a lot of followers and they seem perhaps like they are an expert, but it's kind of this question of like, what is an expert nowadays? Because that person is not you with an actual license to talk about this. So do you have any fears about the way that society is going, in the sense of like really so heavily putting a mass amount of uh respect into like people who are not trained to talk about mental health?
I mean, this is such a good question. And on the one hand, I love the decentralization and the democratization of spreading information. I love that like some people have always just happened to have a really good therapist, and lucky for them. But these days, we can all have a really good therapist if we just follow that person on Instagram. And I think it's different than being in one-on-one therapy with them, but it sure is better than nothing. So I love the access to this information. Going back to that idea from earlier, that the most important thing to cultivate is listening to yourself. We should not ever blindly accept advice from anybody, no matter how credentialed, no matter whether or not they call themselves an expert, no matter how many followers. You always want to do the gut check for yourself. Does this resonate for me? Does this feel safe for me? Does this feel oversimplified? And so you just want to gut check everything. But I think it's all better than nothing, as long as we can do that filter process for ourselves. That said, social media itself is playing this really double-edged sword kind of role in our lives, and it gives us access to amazing community and to connect to like-minded people and to learn from experts. But the fact that we're pouring our attention into our phone, into these algorithms that don't have our best interests in mind, that really they are designed to hold an increasingly large share of our attention. And often our mental health is the collateral damage. And the tricks that they use to hold our attention are preying on our fear response, instilling uncertainty or doubt, controversy. This is what makes us rubberneck and hand over our attention. And that does not help us feel intact or whole. And I think the nature of sound bites and comment sections and anonymity and relational aggression, all of that can just leave us feeling very surrounded by a lot of contentious energy. And so I don't think it's necessarily a force for peace and love in the world. And so
I also, yeah. No, go
we just
ahead.
we just need to be really intentional about our relationship to the phone and social media. It can't just be that we're blindly defaulting into it. We have to think, this is when I look on, this is who I follow, this is who I don't follow. And we need guardrails in place so that we're not just letting it suck all of our attention and leaving us strung out.
I wonder how much that access also could make people feel more lonely.
Yeah.
And I want to get into that briefly in a moment, but I have always been kind of an open book with mental health, dealing with my own struggles, because I think it's something that needs to be spoken about, and hopefully I can do that with my platform. But there's a lot of people, friends of mine especially, who don't want to talk about this, right? And I want to bring up an example of a good friend of mine. He's late 30s, and he was asking me the other day, what did I think about Lexapro? And I was like, all right, buddy, you're either talking about like what's going on, right? I was like, I can tell you, but also like, is it for you, or you want advice for your friend? And he finally was like, it's for me. And I was like, I would highly suggest you speak to a therapist first. And he was like, I'll talk to my doctor and see what they say. And obviously, like, I'm not a doctor, nor am I going to tell him what to do with his life, besides like help him in any way that I can. But it made me concerned that I got the sense he was still in that bucket of people who are like, therapy is for weak people, therapy doesn't exist, like talking about my feelings. And men struggle with this a lot. So what's your opinion on that? Perhaps someone listening's friend is really depressed or anxious. What do we do? Like, how do we advise our friends in that way? And especially with talk therapy.
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough. The good news is the stigma is decreasing, and there's increasingly fewer people that think of it as this is for the weak. But it still exists, and there are cultural considerations to that, certainly gender considerations to that. And I think that I love the work of Liz Plank. She has the tag Feminist Fabulous, and she wrote a book called For the Love of Men. She really talks about the pressures on men. And just as we're so familiar with the straitjacket that women are wearing, all of our conditioning, all of the expectations on us, and men have their own set. And I think that that's where I certainly come at this with compassion when somebody doesn't feel comfortable talking about or admitting or normalizing mental health issues. The more that we can talk about it and just keep repeating how universal this is. We're all struggling in some way. We all know someone who's struggling in a very serious way. This is universal, and in many ways, certainly not a sign of some moral failing or some weakness. It's in many ways an appropriate response to how out of balance we're living these days. And so it's not a sign of pathology necessarily, or more so of health in a pathologic environment. And I think that when we are a friend in a situation like that, we can remind ourselves the most important credential to help a friend in those moments is just our own humanity and what we've been through. We don't need necessarily special training or to have the perfect thing to say to be able to generously listen and hold space for someone and kind of lean in and nod and say, and not get squirmy and wiggly if someone starts to cry. Like we have all these habits that basically shut down emotional honest conversations. And the more we can really mindfully and intentionally say, like, I'm here for this, I will hold space for this, it just gives people permission to be with what they're really feeling. And that's the beginning of how we help someone move forward.
I read a statistic, and I just pulled it up now on my laptop to see that an average of 7.8 people in the study in the UK actually reported feeling lonely from November 2022 to February 2023. You wrote this book during a pandemic. I know you have a one child, correct? Or is it
That's
two?
right.
You have one child. I know you're married. So loneliness perhaps would maybe hit you at this stage a little bit different because you're living with a partner and a child. But during the pandemic, I think we all saw not only how the phones can make us feel very lonely, but also perhaps how lonely in reality we are as a society. So someone who's listening to this, who is struggling with making friends, is struggling with figuring out their anxiety, and is feeling overall just very lonely, what is your advice for them?
I mean, I am, you're right. My life is very full right now, but I've been lonely. And, and I think that we really have a societal problem in this way. Social media plays a role. I think of it almost like artificial sugar that tricks our body into thinking we just ate something sweet when we didn't. Like it becomes something that tricks us into thinking we just had social connection. And it's not nothing. The way we can connect with people online has value, but it is also an opportunity cost, and it can scratch an itch inadequately such that we're not driven to then go out and connect with people in real life. And I think that meets a gestalt of sensory needs and energetic needs that we have in a way social media never can. And if we're at home scrolling or gaming or whatever it is, we are sucked in and we don't have that impetus to get up and out and go connect with people. I think the most important thing is to recognize you're allowed to build social connection that is what you want to do. Like, I think I came of age thinking, here's how people connect. It's in a bar, or it's at a party, or it's a loud thing, or a networking thing, or a happy hour. And that was not my scene. And it was much later that I was like, well, what is my scene? It's having a game night. It's taking a walk in a quiet park with one friend. And so now I much more have an attitude of if you build it, they will come. If you build the kind of social connection that fills your cup and affirms you, it's a really good filter for the kind of people who feel the same way, and they're the ones who will show up. And so we can just choose for ourselves how we want to fill our cup socially, and you don't need to fit yourself into the mold of how other people do it.
Ellen, you're working on a second book. Tell me what that's about.
So that's in a very exploratory early phase, but it's about intuition, and it's about somewhat of a feminist reclamation of owning up to the fact that we exist in a universe that is vastly beyond our comprehension. And I feel like, when I think about salves to anxiety, what I tried to build towards at the end of my first book was that we need to find a way to be less in a vibration of fear and more in a vibration of trust and surrender. And so this book is sort of an entire exploration of that concept, like how do we do that realistically? And I think it has a lot to do with when we do feel any indication that this is a magical universe, rather than rushing to question that or to be like, that's silly, that's frivolous, that's ridiculous, that's irrational, which I think is patriarchy shutting us down. I think we want to give ourselves permission to just own it, because ultimately it brings us meaning and comfort, transcendence, connection to people we love who have passed, a sense of meaning and guidance as we're trying to figure out our careers. It brings us so much, so we can stop silencing it or feeling ashamed of that belief and just unapologetically own our magic.
What do you want the biggest takeaway from any of your books to be?
Hmm. I think that it's actually just I want people to recognize that they are lovable, that they are loved, and that they are love.
I love that. Ellen, where can everyone find you on social media? Pick up a copy of your book. I don't know if you're doing any consulting or if you're doing any, sessions and whatnot, having new clients. What about that?
Yeah, so on social media, I'm most active on Instagram. I'm at Ellen Vora, MD. And then my book, The Anatomy of Anxiety, is available everywhere that books are sold. And that's really my life's work up until this point in 230 some pages. And I have a goal of doing online groups again. I did that in the past. I loved it. I get a little bit underwater when I'm writing a book, and all of my chi goes toward that, but I do plan on doing that again. So my website, ellenvora.com, where you can sign up for my newsletter, is the best way to find out when I'm opening up the next online group.
Well, Dr. Vora, thank you so much. Thank you for your book. It got me through quite a month in October. No more Lexapro needed. No judgment, of course, if anyone is on that. But my particular experience was that I didn't think I needed it, and I didn't know it was doing what I felt like your book was able to teach me to do, and to stop working so much, and like these simple things that actually have a lot of merit and meaning to it. So my biggest takeaway from that, I mean, I love the bone broth in the morning now. It's a bit of an expensive habit, so I need to figure out how to make it at home. But I realize that it's an awesome thing in the morning, and I feel so good and so healthy. And so thank you so much.
Alexa, I'm so glad. And when you make your art, you write your book, you put it in the world, you can only dream that it might fall in the hands of someone who's struggling. And I'm so sorry you were struggling, but that this was able to give you a path to climb out. It's like the most fulfilling thing about putting all of these ideas into a book. Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, marrow bones are cheap, so you can get those at the butcher, make your own. There's all kinds of more affordable ways of getting bone broth these days. So
And I got your book at first at the library, actually, before I bought it. So for those of you who are also listening and don't feel like you can afford a book right now, her book was at the library. So perhaps head over to your local library, see if you can find it there. And if not, you can certainly look for it online or whatnot. But thank you all so much for tuning into a new episode of The New Unfiltered. You can follow the show at The New Unfiltered on social media. And of course, you can interact with this episode right when you're listening to it on Spotify. There's some questions and whatnot throughout. So thank you guys so much for listening, and tune in for a new episode of The New Unfiltered. See you guys next week. Bye.